the US has no plan B. It has only plan A, and plan A consists of world domination, which it is increasingly out of its grasp. For me, that word is definitely Gaza and Palestine. I think that while it did not change the trajectory on which the world was going, it has vastly accelerated the progress of the world on a certain trajectory. What trajectory was it? Well, essentially, it is the trajectory in which the US attempts to control events around the world, control the world basically in general, are rapidly unraveling. Now, this was already becoming clear in the war against Russia, the proxy war against Russia, which was conducted with Ukraine as a proxy, because no matter how many millions the United States and the Europeans, encouraged by the United States, were pouring into Ukraine, no matter how many armaments they were giving, it was not possible for them to help Ukraine to defeat Russia. And remember, this attack on proxy war against Russia was undertaken with the blithe assumption that they were going to defeat the Russians and they were going to reduce the Russian economy to, bomb it back to the Stone Age and reduce the ruble to a ruble and all this rhetoric. And essentially, as you may remember, in the fall of 2021, the US, right after two events happened, the Afghanistan withdrawal, which was so ignominious for the United States, and Mrs. Merkel stopping being the Chancellor of Germany. Once these two events were out of the way, the United States essentially began an attempt to reduce Russia essentially into a kind of, force Russia into succumbing, fully confident that Russia would not initiate any kind of military action, but Russia did. And that was the beginning of the unraveling of the American strategy. So that was already happening. But I think essentially what has happened is with the resistance of the Palestinians finally bubbling forth in Gaza, what has happened is that this unraveling of American attempts to dominate the world is unraveling. And this is happening in a number of ways. Number one, it's very clear that the United States, so the first thing is that in a certain sense, the United States pivot to Asia has not worked. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that when the United States decided that it was time to sort of shrug off and shed the commitments and obligations that they have incurred in the Middle East and start focusing on China, that's what they would dearly like to do. That's where they feel the main competitive threat to the United States is coming from. But in a certain sense, this is compelling their attention, their energy, their resources back to the Middle East. It is a Middle East which they do not even control, in the sense that they cannot even control Israel, let alone anybody else. So on the one hand, Israel is essentially acting like a rogue state. The United States is reduced to essentially pleading with Israel, saying, please don't do this and that, only because they know that they are losing the battle of world opinion. So they are pleading with Israel to do this, that, and the other, but they are not succeeding. At the same time, it is not as though, despite all the efforts of the last many decades, they have not been able to bring the Arab countries of the region over to the side of Israel. So essentially what they are looking at is that the Arab countries, while they are not engaging in any military intervention in the situation, but they are also essentially on the side of the Palestinians for one very simple reason. No Arab government, no matter how much they want to cozy up to Israel, can afford the unpopularity that such actions will bring, even if they are quite an authoritarian government. So that's the first one. The second one is that I would say that there is an economic, what I call what I do geopolitical economy for a reason, because I think that economic and political power is very deeply interconnected, as we see, for example, in the case of China. But anyway, in the case of the United States, it's the reverse, in the sense it's the mirror image. Economic weakness brings political weakness. But that is also that we are going to see that what has happened in Gaza is going to make the economic management much more difficult in an election year. So, for example, the Federal Reserve is essentially proclaiming that it has won the battle against inflation. It has signaled that it's going to bring down interest rates. But I would say that I would watch this brief very carefully for one very simple reason. Inflation has not been kept down for 2 decades or for many decades since the 1980s because of the skill of the Federal Reserve. It was kept down largely because the United States was still able to compel much of the world, not all of it, but much of the world, to supply it with cheap goods. on an ongoing basis. But that arrangement has broken down, which means that and this is one of the main purposes of US imperialism, is to keep getting cheap goods, cheap commodities, cheap labor. All of those things are not going to work. Food prices and fuel prices are going up, but so are the prices of manufactured commodities. And as we see with the Gaza situation, it has led to the disruption of Red Sea, the Suez Canal transport corridor, which then means that there is a massive addition to the costs of goods coming to Europe, to the United States, etc. And so all of this is going to, and this is just one of the many uncertainties that is going to add to inflation. And finally, I would say that, since keeping the dollar as the world's money has been one of the main objectives of the United States, I would say that in 2023, we began to see the shaking of the foundations of this. And with the Gaza conflict in particular, what we have seen is that essentially the world is uniting against United States and is increasingly able to find ways of, and essentially the oil producing regions and the rest of the BRICS are going to come together today. Iran, Saudi Arabia, etc., are part of the BRICS bloc. And I think under Russia's presidency this coming year, this process will also accelerate. So for all of these reasons, I would say that the Gaza events, the Hamas actions, and the Palestinian actions, essentially reminding the world that their very, very burning issue remained unresolved, that Israeli oppression was only increasing. And so this reminder is, I would say, the defining event of 2023. I'm not a betting person, so I would say that both are possibilities. So I would say that the gradual unraveling is already occurring. So US dollar's role as a major reserve currency is declining. More and more transactions are now taking place outside the dollar system. But I would say that there are two or three fronts on which I would watch. Number one is, this whole question of inflation is directly relevant to the dollar system because it puts the US Federal Reserve in a bind. So on the one hand, the Federal Reserve has had for the last couple of decades a regime of easy monetary policy, and that has meant that essentially all these financial structures have been constructed on the basis of that regime. And raising interest rates threatens financial stability in the United States, and that has direct implications for the dollar system because the vastly bloated dollar-denominated financial system, which is headquartered in the United States, has historically, over the last couple of decades, played the function of essentially attracting the world's money into it to the extent that these investors want to make easy money. And so this money after 2008 was already drastically reduced. And now if there are further shall we say, further disturbances, and we already saw some disturbances in the spring of 2023 with the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank and several other banks. I would say that if inflation persists and the Federal Reserve has to keep interest rates high or maybe even raise them higher, then this financial structures will collapse, and that will mean that the dollar system's credibility will waver because, all the advocates of the dollar system, the ones who say, oh, the dollar system is working very well, they're constantly referring to the broad and deep financial markets of the United States. Well, they will seem very quickly appear to be very shallow and narrow. And so in that sense, we will see what happens. And then on the other hand, if the Federal Reserve decides to preserve financial stability and not increase interest rates, it's going to have a serious problem because essentially the inflation itself will undermine the value of the dollar. And so in both cases, it's caught between a rock and a hard place. So that's one thing. And as I said, the other thing is that I don't think that they can expect inflation not to continue because increasingly the US power is receding. And with US power will recede its ability to compel the rest of the world to yield up their commodities, their manufactured goods, their labor at a low price. And this is what the United States has benefited from for the last 4.5 decades. It's because why the reason, the most profound reason why this has happened is because the United States and Western elites in general are living in the past. They think that their relative power compared to the rest of the world continues to be as great as it once was, but this is no longer true. So it's like somebody who thinks they have got a very powerful, weapon in their hands, but all they have is a water pistol. Because you see this, so having point made that analogy, let me get down to the concrete reasons. First of all, the imposition of sanctions themselves has been very patchy. What do I mean by that? They have tried to design the sanctions in such a way that existing businesses in their own countries, whether it is the United States or Germany or Canada, are not unduly hurt, which means that a lot of these businesses are continuing to do business with Russia simply because they don't want to hurt them. Secondly, Russia has been able to rebuild its economy very quickly. And remember, it had a long lead period because the first sanctions were imposed in the aftermath of the events of 2014. So Russia faced agricultural sanctions, and in the period since 2014, Russia managed to turn around its agricultural economy in such a way that it is today a major exporter of grain, fertilizers, etc., etc. So that experience was already there, and Russia has been able to essentially engage in a form of import substituting industrialization, and it has proved very good at that. And I think the government has done that. So I would say that a combination of things, the West's power to essentially cut off the rest of the world is not as great as it once was. And the fact of the matter is that Russia has taken a proactive stance on this. So it has been able to outdo those sanctions. There remains the question of financial sanctions, but the fact again is that there are, especially now that if today, the financial sanctions only matter to you if you are greatly desirous of participating. You and your capitalist classes are greatly desirous of participating in the casino that is the US financial sector. If you don't wish to participate in that, you can organize your trade and even your investment relations outside the ambit of the US financial system. Why is that? Because the US financial system, in fact, does not exist to facilitate trade. In fact, it distorts trade and investment relations by artificially increasing the value of the US dollar, etc. And also, of course, introducing fluctuations in it and so on. But on the other hand, as well, the other reason is that historically, this system has been created, for instance, by asking other countries to lift capital controls so that the rich people of their country could participate in these casino-like arrangements. This creation of this system was justified by saying to countries who people, and the Clinton administration, they would say to countries, if you lift capital controls, it's very good for you because you will get the much needed capital that you need for your productive investment. But in reality, this never happen. The only kind of money that went into the countries that lifted capital controls was essentially short-term capital, which was there to not invest productively, but in fact to engage in speculation and make quick gains and then leave. And so this, of course, was also very volatile, destabilizing. It led to financial crises and so on. So quite frankly, the world does not need the dollar system. The world does not need the US financial system. But so for all these reasons, I would say that the dollar system is going to unravel pretty soon. Yeah. I would say that there was the China celebrating decade of the Belt and Road Initiative and its success. I think that was an important thing. I think events in Latin America, particularly vis-a-vis the US being forced to soften its position vis-a-vis Venezuela, was another very important thing. I think that the BRICS, the admission of 5 new countries into the BRICS. And now, speaking of Venezuela, the possibility that in 2024, under the Russian presidency, new countries, including countries like Venezuela, would be admitted to the BRICS. I think all of these will be very momentous developments. I would also say that other developments that are important is the sharpening of the confrontation between the United States and China. Although we have seen certain developments taking place, top-level US officials going to China, and even President Xi and President Biden having a meeting. But as you know, very quickly after the meeting, the whole thing has unraveled. So it is not at all very clear. So the United States is kind of essentially leaving pots boiling on many different elements, in the sense that its problematic relationship with China is far from resolved. Remember, 2022 ended with the promise of better relations because President Xi and President Biden met on the sidelines of that meeting in Indonesia. I forget which one it was. I think it was a G20 meeting. And then everybody expected that there would be good relations, but then the United States went hysterical over the spy balloon and everything else happened and so on. But I would say that throughout all of this, the United States has acted irresponsibly, provocatively, rudely, and in ways that it cannot sustain because it has threatened things that it cannot actually back up. There is no back. It cannot actually do. Whereas I would say that the President Xi and his government and his diplomats and everyone have essentially engaged with the United States in particular with a remarkable combination of a calm demeanor against provocation, not taking it as a personal insult, but behaving calmly even when the United States has been behaving insultingly because they know that the prospects for world peace depend on them. And so I would say that China has very good reasons to be proud of its government, of its president, of its diplomats, because I think that this has been generally the demeanor. They have kept the larger picture in mind that you cannot create a warlike situation between the United States and China and not endanger world peace. So they have kept that larger view in mind. And I think they have behaved exceedingly responsibly. And I would say with as I say, great self-command and restraint. China is very happy to be a prosperous society in a world of prosperous societies. The United States is the opposite. It has, on the one hand, organized its internal economy so badly that actually it cannot beat China. China is going to beat it unless there is a 180-degree turn in US economic policy, but we don't see any prospect of that. At the same time, therefore, because it cannot actually quietly look after itself and, compete with China, it is trying to thwart China. And so this is what we see. And also it is doing so increasingly. So in its attempts, what will happen inevitably is that if it does manage to provoke a confrontation, it is not going to necessarily win that confrontation. It is not going to necessarily successfully thwart China. It may, of course, set China back a year or two, but at the end of the day, it does not have the ability to win wars, even against countries like Afghanistan or Iraq or Libya. Or how is it going to cope against a powerful country like China? It is just nonsense. But unfortunately, like I often say, the US has no plan B. It has only plan A, and plan A consists of world domination, which it is increasingly out of its grasp. But because there is no sensible voice saying, you know what, folks, we don't need this. We can be like other good international citizens. We can be a country that looks after its own, which the US clearly does not. If you look at the levels of poverty, inequality, homelessness, lack of medical care, etc. But the US does not wish to address those things, and instead it wishes to engage in this hollow competition. It can only end badly, and all one can hope is that the kind of restraint which is being showed by leaders like Xi, and I would also say President Putin, will prevail in the end. They will not lead to any unnecessary wars, and we may even prevail over the US's worst provocations and give the world the peace it needs to pursue development. Finally, I should say that I think, I can't remember exactly whether they were published in 2023 or the previous year, but the various policy documents that China has brought forward, the Global Security Initiative, the Development Initiative, etc., these documents have also provided a very important guideline, so to speak, for the definitely emerging multipolar world order, because that's the flip side of the unraveling of US power, is that the world order is creating greater space for countries to choose development and to develop their own countries.
Do you guys think? How is the professor's geopolitical breakdown? Please leave your comment below. We would love to hear from you.
Thank you for making it this far. If you like this video, you might want to share it with a like-minded friend. Thank you, and as always, stay blessed.